Okay, so we're talking about Jean-Paul Sartre, and we're talking about the text that I sent you, which is Existentialism is a Humanism. All right, so what are we talking about with Jean-Paul? Jean-Paul Sartre is a very famous and influential French philosopher, primarily after the Second World War. Okay, here he is with his lifelong companion, Simone de Beauvoir, who we'll talk about next week. Simone de Beauvoir is also an existentialist and a feminist. And he's sitting here with Che Guevara. Okay, so if you don't know Che Guevara is a pretty hardcore character as well. And what do I want to say? Okay, with Jean-Paul Sartre. Let me give you some kind of key words. For Sartre, especially in this text, he's concerned with the idea of freedom. Freedom and responsibility. Those are two key concepts. Okay, for Sartre, we are free. Okay. You are always free. For Sartre, being free is a kind of a fundamental feature of human existence. It's like an inextinguishable flame. You can diminish the flame, but that flame is always there. Okay. And because you are free, you are responsible. And he gives us a very big sense of responsibility. You are responsible not only for yourself, but you are responsible really for the world. The world is a consequence of us and what we choose to do and what we choose to value and what we choose to direct our energy and attention towards. Okay. What else I want to say? A few things. Jean-Paul Sartre is one of the clear atheistic existentialists. Okay. And part of his argument about freedom, he constructs that argument around a premise of atheism. Okay. He basically says, if God does not exist, then we are really in a free-for-all. Okay. But he's going to say, if we are in a free-for-all, then what we do with our lives and what we end up doing as a species on this planet, there's no one else to blame but ourselves. Okay. So it's up to us whether we want to, in the coming decades, if we want to basically destroy ourselves off at the courtesy of the widespread nuclear warfare, or whether we want to eat everything away until we have nothing but a desert left, or whether we want to live in harmony, or whether we want to try living on other planets. It's up to us. There is no for Sartre, you have to understand Sartre's philosophy as a kind of radically opposed to any form of determinism. Okay. We are limited. Our freedom is limited. Okay. We can think of several ways, and we've already mentioned several, in which our freedom is limited. But Sartre is going to say there's always that freedom there. What he's going to say is this. He doesn't say it exactly this way, but this is basically what he's going to. It's not your circumstances that define you. You are not a product of your circumstances. Your circumstances are always a starting point. You are always in a specific moment wherein you are locked into some given circumstances. And those circumstances you have no say over. Okay. But you always have, for Sartre, the choice of what to do with those circumstances. Okay. And he's going to say how you respond, how you take responsibility of any given situation. Those are truly the things that are going to define you ultimately. For Sartre, you are the sum of your actions. All right. So that's what we need to unpack. So two key ideas there is freedom and responsibility. Another key idea, and this one I definitely want you to retain, is this starting line here. Okay, he says that this is basically the key idea of existentialism. What he calls existence precedes essence. We exist before we know why we exist. For Sartre, he regards this as fundamental. All right. In simple terms, it means that although a person exists, there is nothing to dictate that person's character, that person's goal in life, and so on. Only that person themselves can define their essence. So he says, man, first of all, exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards. Okay. And for Sartre, there is nothing other than what you do with your life. Okay, that's it. For Sartre, there's another key concept with Sartre is this idea of nothingness, that this life is really devoid of meaning, that there is no, he says that explicitly, okay, there is no meaning, okay? And he says there are two things that result from that. The first thing that results from that is what he calls a nausea. That's his word as well, okay? We have a sort of an anxiety or a nausea. We have an angst, okay? The really contemplating the prospect that your life is meaningless gives you a kind of what he calls an existential anguish. Okay, you feel like, you know, you're just perpetually falling into a bottomless pit. There is nothing, there's nowhere for you to stand on. Okay, but he says that is enough to make most people turn away from the philosophical contemplation of the nothingness of life. Okay, there's a fear that is accompanied with it, but he says if you face it, there is an epiphany. Okay, the epiphany is that I am, and we all are, the creators of this world. Okay, so he says we are responsible for ourselves, and we are responsible for humanity insofar as we are alive. Okay, now let me just kind of unpack that a little bit. This idea of freedom. What he's going to say is this. He's going to say most people, there's kind of two things. Most people either take freedom for granted, but more specifically, he would say, I guess you can ask that question. Okay, I ask that question sometimes in class. It's a little bit harder to do over Zoom, you know, like raise your hands. But for how many of you do you think about freedom and the limitations of freedom? Okay, so I highly encourage you to watch that documentary as well, the BBC documentary on Jean-Paul Sartre. Okay, one of his friends, a fellow philosopher, sort of asked that question. He says maybe people are not concerned with freedom nowadays. Okay, either they take it for granted or it's simply not kind of something that they think about. Sartre was obsessed with this question of freedom. Okay, and this is what he's going to say. He's going to say that if you were to actually, this is basically what he's going to say. He's going to say that if you actually present somebody, if you show them how free they are, they're not going to hug you and embrace you. They're more likely that they're going to run away. We are what Sartre is going to say is we are really kind of afraid of our freedom. We think about freedom as, you know, oh, I'm free to get my coffee at, I'm free to get my iced coffee at McDonald's or Tim Hortons or Starbucks. And that's how a lot of us entertain freedom. You know, you're free as a kind of a consumer in a capitalist market society. Sartre's going to say, no, that's not what freedom is. Okay, freedom is understanding that your actions have a weight, that your actions have a bearing, that your actions shape who you are. And that is not something that you can run away from. It's not something that you can ignore. All right. So let me just say this, and you're going to see that he also has kind of a paradoxical sense of freedom. So for Sartre, there's always this kind of, and even with Simone de Beauvoir, they're sitting here with Che Guevara, okay, the Cuban revolutionary. There is a sense of revolution. You always have to try to assert your freedom. There's always a kind of perpetual revolution. You always have to try to some extent, take what is and break it. Okay, you always have to reach. This is how Simone de Beauvoir is going to say it. We have the true use of freedom is not okay. You know, I can go buy my coffee here, my coffee there. The true use of freedom is always a stretching out towards other newer freedoms. Okay, so it's kind of a revolutionary thing. So this is what he would say. Okay, he would say, in what way are we free? We're free in kind of two ways. He would say that most of us are free in the way that you can have, let's say, a caged animal, and you can open up the cage. Okay, you are free. You are free to exit the cage. But what most people would do is, though they are free, they'd say, you know what? I think I'm going to stay in the cage. It's just like Plato's cave. Okay, you can exit Plato's cave, but most people would say, no, ignorance is bliss. I'm gonna stay in the cage. Okay, it's the freedom of a caged animal when the cage is open to simply walk out. But many of us do not, because we don't want to face the burden. It's really a kind of a weight, a burden of having to have that. Well, what am I going to do once I'm free? Okay. And another way of understanding freedom is not so much a caged animal, but a kind of a cornered animal. Okay, like when you have, let's say, a cornered dog, there is something, and this is probably the better one. This is probably the better interpretation of freedom, that you at one point, I think I have the quote from Fight Club here. Hold on, I think it's right here, if it doesn't freeze on me. So a famous quote from Fight Club, okay? It's only after you've lost everything that you're free to do anything. Like a cornered animal, at one point, there's nothing more for you to lose. And so at that point, you don't know how that animal is going to act, okay? Once your back is up against the wall, you sort of recognize something. You are forced to you are forced to recognize this inextinguishable spark of freedom, which is there, okay? And then the point is that this animal can act sporadically. The animal can act really kind of spontaneously. It can act contrary to all its training and all its nature, okay? Because it kind of breaks out of any sort of predetermined, deterministic mold that it may have. And he says, Sartre is going to say, you only truly recognize your freedom once you are put in a position that requires you to understand choice, okay, and the magnitude of choice. Like specifically, let's say a dilemma, okay? So this is what he says. Specifically, his philosophy can be seen as, especially this is philosophy of freedom, as a kind of a response to the Second World War and the aftermath after the Second World War, okay? It's like, everything that we took for granted is basically destroyed. So now what do? Okay, do we try to reestablish the old order? Or do we realize that there is this kind of window of opportunity that we can sort of rebuild a kind of a new society? But what Sartre is going to say is you don't necessarily need a war. That prospect is always there. Okay, so he says, jamais nous avons été plus libres que sous l'occupation allemande. Nous avons perdu tous nos droits et d'abord celui de parler. So that's kind of paradoxical. There you have kind of that paradox. We were never freer than under German occupation. How does that make sense? Because it's precisely under such a circumstance that your freedom, that your choices are made clear to you. Okay, you feel the weight of your choices. Let's jump into this here. Okay, so let me see if there's anything else that I want to say, kind of leading into this. No, let's proceed. So he says he's going to build this kind of argument about freedom. Okay, he says there is no human nature because there is no God to have conceived of it. Man simply is. So this is like a very atheistic argument, and he feels that this is kind of necessary to establish his idea of freedom. I'm not sure if I agree. I think that you can, in some sense, establish his same sense of freedom without having to take an atheistic premise. Okay, and this idea that if God does not exist, then everything would be permitted. We are in a sort of free-for-all. Human existence precedes essence. Okay, he's going to say this is something specific and unique about human beings. We are human beings. We find ourselves in this world before we know what to do with this world. Okay, we do not come predetermined. We do not come with an instruction manual. Okay, we have to basically figure it out for ourselves. And so consequently, he says, therefore, I bear responsibility of the choices, which in committing myself also commit the whole of humanity. We are also shaping humanity through our choices. Okay, so let's kind of unpack this. Let me see, is there anything else I wanted to say? If you guys have any questions or comments, just jump right in. Okay. Let me say this. He's going to say, just to kind of elaborate on that whole paradox of freedom. You know, he says, we've never freer than under German occupation. He says, even in prison, one is free. Because again, it's not the circumstances, but it's what you do with those circumstances. If you are a prisoner, you can allow yourself to go crazy. You can join a gang. You can write a book. You can read a book. You can figure out what you're going to do once you get out. You can try to figure out how to escape. In some circumstances, your options are limited. Okay, but it's not about the number of options that are available to you. There are always options. Okay, he's going to say even if you face a firing squad, you still have a choice of how are you going to respond to the circumstances. Okay, you can piss your pants, or you can plead for mercy, or you can cry, or you can call them bastards, or you can pray to God, or you can stand there and just take it. So that also goes back to Che Guevara. Okay. Che Guevara faced the firing squad. they had him, and they, I don't know, they captured in Bolivia, and they had him. They said, okay, who's going to shoot Che Guevara? So one guy said, okay, give me the gun. I'm gonna shoot this guy. So he went in to shoot Che Guevara, and Che Guevara said, no, go ahead and shoot me, you coward. You can only kill a man. You can't kill the idea. So even up until the very last moment, okay, up until your very last breath, you are free. All right. Let me try to put it this way, and then I'm gonna stick with the slides. With regards to that whole idea of a circumstance, is again, it's not the circumstances that you're given; it's what you do with the circumstances. I think that's basically what he's gonna say. And it's always up to you what you choose to do with the circumstance. It's very empowering in a way. It's very, but it's also very scary. Consider this, okay? You can be born as a white man into a rich family in the United States, and consequently, societally speaking, you have all the doors open for you, okay? Everything is, all options are available to you. You can also simultaneously born as a kind of a poor woman into a rural village in Yemen, and consequently, for whatever reason, so societally, culturally, you are much more limited. Okay, you do not have the same sort of opportunity. But what Sartre is going to say, it's not the circumstances that you are born into; it's what you do with those circumstances. So the point is, you can be, this rich white man into an affluent family in the United States, and your life can amount to nothing. You can amount to absolutely nothing. Or you can be, a poor woman in a rural village in Yemen, and despite the limitations of the perceived limitations of that circumstance, you can live a life which is much more worthy of, let's say, a movie, or is much more worthy of a biography written about you than the other person. So for Sartre, you have to view your life that way. Your life is, and he keeps using that analogy, your life is a portrait which you paint, okay? Your life is the story that you make of it. Your life is really, the prevailing analogy is your life is an artwork. Living is an artwork, okay? Choosing is an artwork. And your medium is your life, and the paint is your freedom, okay? The paint is your freedom and your choices, okay? For Sartre, there are no excuses. A lot of people don't like to hear that, okay? A lot of people like making excuses. Oh, well, I was born into this family, and I was born into this race, and I was born into this class, and I was born with this and that. Yeah, sure, that can all be true. And those are definitely limiting factors, but those aren't the fundamental deciding factor, okay? So it's also like, and again, how would you judge somebody? Let me try to put it this way: what is the most defining feature about you? And if you say, if the most defining feature about you is something which you really had no say over, Sartre would say is you're missing the point. You know what I mean? If the most defining feature about me is, I'm rich or I'm poor, or I'm a man or a woman, or I'm black or I'm white, you had really for the most part, you had no say over that. So why would the most defining feature about you be something that you didn't have any say over? Okay, you're ultimately going to be judged for the things that you do for yourself. So that goes to a quote from Martin Luther King. Okay, Martin Luther King says, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember it verbatim, but he says, "I look forward to the day where a man will be judged by the content of his character and not by the color of his skin," which is precisely how it should be, because the color of your skin is a mere circumstance about you. Okay, I should not praise you or demean you for something that you have no control over. But your fundamental merits will reside in what you have done with your actions, what you have done with your circumstances. Okay, so let's proceed here. Let's see what time here. Okay, I'm doing pretty good. So he says he wants us to entertain this idea. He said everything that is made with a specific purpose in mind. Okay, that is to say, the essence of the object precedes the making or the manufacturing of the object. He says everything that is made by an artisan is made with that particular schema, that particular pattern. I make scissors, and I don't discover the utility of the scissors after the fact. I make the scissors in accordance with the utility that I already have in mind. Okay, if that makes sense. But again, I have to disagree with him here, because sometimes things are made and we discover sort of unintended applications or consequences of those artifacts after the fact. Okay, but let's give him the kind of the benefit of the doubt here. He says everything that is made, in other words, the blueprint, comes before the actual making. And he uses the examples of what he calls a coupe papier. Okay, I don't know what a coupe papier is. Okay, let's assume it says scissors. He says the purpose of the purpose, the reason, the raison d'être of the scissors precedes the actual making of the scissors, and the making of the scissors are going to be produced in a certain way that fits that use or that purpose. Okay, in the same way that if you're going to erect a building downtown Montreal, like, you have to know what that building is going to serve before you actually start digging the foundation. You have to have a blueprint of the building. And let's say if you're building a condo building, for the most part, the condo units will already, the hypothetical condo units will already be sold. People will already have put down payments on the condo units before you even start digging a hole for the foundation. Okay, the reason for being exists prior to the actual existence. He says this is true of all things. Okay, that is to say, for all things that are made, the essence, its purpose or reason for being, comes before its existence. And generally, okay, we can give him the benefit of the doubt. Yeah, that's mostly true. And now he's going to take this idea of the making and he's going to sort of apply it to God. Okay, so he's going to say, if we think of God in the kind of typical Christian European conception of God, God as a supreme artisan, then God also made us with a specific objective in mind. Okay, he did not make Adam and Eve arbitrarily or randomly. It was not aléatoire. He made Adam and Eve with a specific reason in mind. Okay, so that is to say, for Sartre, if God exists, there is a fixed human purpose. Okay, and he's going to go on to say, then consequently, if God does not exist, then we're here for no reason at all. Okay, so he says, what if there was no God? What if God does not exist? Then he says, if God does not exist, then at least human beings are beings without an essence. There is no blueprint for us. There is no meaning to our lives. There is no purpose for us to exist. And consequently, and this is that's the scary part, the beautiful part that comes if you stare at it, is what comes is there is no reason to exist. Therefore, my reason for existing is something that I make up for myself, which is interesting. Okay, if God does not exist, there is at least one thing whose existence precedes his essence, and that is man. There is no human nature because there is no God to have conceived of it. Man simply is. So you have this other idea, I think it's Heidegger, talks about we are just kind of thrown into the world. We just are here, okay? We are a species, if you want to talk about it in the collective sense, we are a species with amnesia, okay? We are sort of reverse engineering our history, trying to figure out where we came from, okay? Trying to figure out, what was mankind doing 10,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, trying to kind of dig through the dirt to try to find artifacts to sort of reconstruct the story of our origins. We are just kind of here, you know what I mean? We're a species with amnesia. We are just kind of thrown here on this planet. And you specifically, you individually, you're just kind of, our individual existence is furthermore also kind of contingent and arbitrary. You were born, but you could have just as easily not been born. You were born a boy, but you could have also been born a girl. Okay, you were born into this particular place in this particular time in this particular family. It could have been otherwise. It was completely probabilistic. Okay, so we're just kind of, you just find yourself here. And he says, when you come, I watch my daughters be born, and the child comes out, and it's crazy. And there's some other stuff that comes out, placenta and blood and all this crazy shit. But there's no instruction manual that comes with the child. So other objects, as let's say my cell phone, when I take my cell phone out of the package, it is a kind of a deterministic object. Its functioning and its use are basically set, okay? And the instruction manual is going to tell me sort of the limitations of its functioning. That's not the case with the human being. Okay, there is no instruction manual. Okay, well, if you say, well, the instruction manual is the Bible, or the instruction manual is the Torah, or whatever, again, then you revert back to the problem that we spoke about in an earlier class, which is, yeah, but the application of that specific Bible or that specific scripture to our modern day is always nonetheless itself a process of interpretation, and therein lies your freedom. You cannot escape it. Okay, again, he would say most people would not want to look at their freedom. We don't want to acknowledge how free we are. Okay, many of us would rather kind of make excuses to give us the sensation that we are not free. All right. So what does he say here? Let me see what else he says. He says, he talks about at one point in the text these philosophers of the Enlightenment period. And he says these philosophers and the physicists of the Enlightenment period, he says they got rid of God. They got rid of the idea of God as the architect of the universe, because they realized that we can understand and account for the physical world that we are in without having to rely on what he calls a costly hypothesis, a costly and unnecessary hypothesis. In other words, from a physics perspective, evoking God does not help you explain anything better from a physical perspective, and it doesn't help you make any better predictions. So from a physical perspective, God is a kind of a meaningless concept, okay? But he says these same philosophers that got rid of God as the architect of the universe, they retained the idea of God as the kind of grand legislator of the universe, and we kept a kind of a society based on, laws and social order. But he says, if you get rid of one, you get rid of the other. If you get rid of God, the architect, you also get rid of God as the kind of grand legislator. Okay. But let me just say this in response to the argument. I think that, look, he's using a very sort of limited, as I said, Christian European conception of God to make this argument. I think that you can believe in God, or you can have some conception of God, wherein you still have the freedom that he is describing here. You don't need to eliminate God in order to have a conception or a worldview wherein you have the degree of freedom that he is talking about. Okay. So here we go. Okay, so we're kind of thrown into this world. Once I left a Nutella sandwich in the back of my locker in high school, and it was abandoned there. It was kind of forsaken there for several months. Okay, and I only discovered it at the end of the school year, when I cleaned out my locker, and it was somehow it was like hermetically sealed under some binders and so on. And when that Nutella sandwich had basically come to life, it was growing all kinds of interesting mold and different kinds of growth on it. So he says we are basically like that. Okay, in the same way that if you have a forsaken orange that is just kind of rolls under your sofa, and you discover it several weeks later, there's a kind of there's penicillin that's growing on it. In the same way, we occur on this planet. We occur on this planet as human beings, in the same way that penicillin occurs on a forsaken orange that has been forgotten under your sofa. Okay, so it's not very flattering. We're not special. Okay, and we're not made with a specific purpose in mind. We are thrown into this kind of nothingness. But now, okay, here's the point. He's going to say that there's something special here, especially when something kind of shakes your worldview and you are forced to contemplate the nothingness of existence. It can be a very meaningful experience. It can be a kind of an epiphany. Okay. Now, this experience of nothingness, maybe some of you guys have felt it. Okay. So you can have this experience in different ways. It can happen to you spontaneously. It can happen to you randomly. It can happen to you as a result of some kind of Buddhist meditation, or as a kind of as a result of some kind of meditation or some kind of religious ritual. The openness of life, or the nothingness of life, however you want to call it, is sort of presented to you. Okay, it can result as a result of the ingestion of certain psychoactive compounds. It can result. This can be triggered by a traumatic event. Let's say, the death of a loved one, or a tragedy, or an accident. It can also happen, as a result of, let's say, reading some good philosophy, can present to you sort of what life is. It can make you aware of the fact that you are alive in a way that you're not normally alive, because as I said in a previous lecture, we are kind of on autopilot, and you just sort of take it for granted. You don't see the forest for the trees, okay? It might happen spontaneously. You have this sort of little epiphany, okay? You might be in a food court eating pad thai, and then all of a sudden you look around and everybody's eating pad thai, and this kind of the absurdity of humanity sort of dawns on you, okay? So he said this feeling of nothingness. So here we go. Let me tell you two stories. Which one do I want to start with? Let me start with this one, okay? Once I was driving to Magog to see my wife, at the time was my girlfriend, and I was driving a bad car with bad tires that I shouldn't have been driving, okay? And usually when a car is going to fail on you, it usually gives you several indications, okay? And then you ignore them at your own peril. So I was driving towards, I was on Highway 10, driving towards Magog. I was around Granby, okay? And it was raining. And I went over an overpass, okay? Presumably going over a river, Yamaska or whatever. And you get those dips, you know, the dips where they join the segments of road there, the asphalt. I hit that dip, and this is what my car did, okay? It went like this, and then it went like this, and went like this, and then it went like this, and then it went into the ditch, and it started to flip over the ditch, okay? And as it was flipping over, I thought to myself, oh, here it is, I'm dead, okay? I was like literally suspended in the air, upside down, about to come crashing down, and I said, there it is, okay, I'm dead. So it's like, that's basically also, you know, the nothingness of life. That you can have a nice narrative to your life. Everything is going nice and dandy, okay? And you therefore presume that there is a kind of a story that is necessarily unfolding, okay? In which you are the kind of the central character. And then it just comes to an end, okay? Literally just like that. At that moment, especially, you know, faced with the imminent prospect of death, it all kind of appears very strange, okay? I wasn't even afraid. I was just kind of, it was just kind of absurd. Absurd is the correct word. And that's the word that that life is absurd. Okay, it just comes. It arises from nothing. It ends in nothing. You just find yourself in this world, and it just ends. Okay, so that's a word that Jean-Paul Sartre likes, and also Albert Camus likes. The absurdity of life. You're faced with the absurdity of life. So I flipped over, and the car came crashing down, and then I was upside down. And I was still alive, and I was amused, okay? And the windows had all shattered, and there was nobody else in the car, thankfully. So I crawled out the window, and I was basically, you know, I was unscratched. I undid my seatbelt, and then I ended up, you know, upside down. I crawled out the window. I had a few scratches on my arm from the broken glass. And then I stepped out, and I was looking at the car, you know, and now at this point, traffic was starting to pile up because people were starting to get curious. And a guy had stopped his car and came running up to me, and he said, hey, are you okay? Are you okay? I said, yeah, I'm okay. Is anybody else in the car? I said, no, nobody's else in the car. So are you okay? And then I looked at him, I said, hey, listen, man, just leave me the fuck alone for about 30 seconds, okay? Let me just take this in, okay? And it was great. So I highly recommend. There was like a car that I bought for like less than $1,000 or something, you know, and it lasted me a year, and I flipped it off the highway, and it was great. You know what I mean? I highly recommend that all of you get into a high speed but safe car crash. Okay. I hope you just destroy your car, or you just destroy your parents' car. Okay. It's very good medicine. It puts things into perspective. Okay. It'll something like that will realign your perspectives in a very, very positive philosophical way. Okay. Let me tell you this other story. This is not as exciting, but when I was young, I forget how old I was. Okay. It always changes every time I tell the story. Let's say I was like 8 years old. Okay. I went to Canadian Tire with my brother and my father. And then I decided to wander off because I wanted to go look at the air rifles. And I looked at the air rifles for a few seconds because I don't even know what I was looking at. And then I turned around and I couldn't see my brother and I couldn't see my father. And I looked down one aisle and they weren't there, and then another one and they weren't there, and another one, they weren't there. And I was running out of aisles. Okay. And so it was starting to dawn on me that I was lost. Now, usually when I survey the class, usually about half of the students in any given class we're lost as a child. Okay, and I suspect that the feeling is kind of common, but there was an instant feeling of the nothingness of life. Okay, that any sense of meaning or stability or foundation was really deeply shaken, and in some sense, kind of ripped from under my feet. Okay. And there's a feeling of nausea and dread and a terrible anxiety. Okay, this feeling of, okay, here's my life, and it's all just basically collapsed. All right. And now the point is this: the point is, I found my father like after 30 seconds. You know what I mean? And this is something that most students also report, is that it feels like an eternity. It feels like a long time from the subjective point of view. But now suppose this, okay? Now some people do not actually find their father. Some people are actually literally, forsaken, literally abandoned. But then the point is, what Sartre is going to say is that nothingness, no matter how you face it, okay, and no matter to what degree you face it, it either drives you to suicide, and if it doesn't drive you to suicide, then you come to the realization that I'm still alive. Okay. And there's a power that comes from that. So here it is. So suppose I didn't find my father, and suppose I was forsaken in Canadian Tire, and the manager closed the store and all the lights, and I was literally the only person left in the store. What you get is initially this feeling of dread. Okay. I'm lost. I've been forsaken. Okay. But what also comes from that immediately is the realization that you're now absolutely free to do whatever you want, that there is no overarching authority figure. So now if I want to go play with the air rifles, I can play with the air rifles. If I want to go play with the bicycles, I can play with the gas. If I want to go play with the flammable car products, I can do that too. Okay, that now it is truly a free-for-all. Okay, and that's basically what Sartre is saying. We are in this, and it is a free-for-all. Okay, life is a free-for-all. So what you get is that once you get past the initial dread, you come to the realization that you are absolutely free. And in some sense, the dread can further you along in the realization that you are totally free. Okay. As I said, Dostoevsky once wrote that if God did not exist, then everything would be permitted. We are in a free-for-all. All right. But then what comes from that is, if you do destroy Canadian Tire and you manage to burn it down to the ground, and then the manager comes in the next day, there's no one to blame but yourself. Okay, so that's the point. This is what Sartre is going to say, is if we are where we are historically, it's not because, of ancient aliens, or because God was watching over us, or because of, some global conspiracy and some Illuminati or some, extraterrestrial influence. We are here just because this is where we as a species have managed to get to. Okay, if we have, let's say, organized society, it's not because we're all bloodthirsty animals that have bloodlust like the Purge, and we're all going to kill each other off. If we have a society at all, the society is the result of us and our choices and our willingness to work together and so on. Nothing came from outside. Okay, that's what Sartre would say. The world that you are in was not preordained or predetermined or pre-orchestrated by any God or higher intelligence or conspiracy theory. Whatever the world is, it is just us, okay? And all our choices and all our virtues and all our blunders and all our, chance discoveries and all our stupid accidents and all our ridiculous experiments have gotten us here. And the same is true for the future, okay? So there's, okay, let me see here. It says, therefore, I and I alone bear responsibility for the world. One creates his own world by supplying the meanings, the interpretations, and the significance of things and events. Since the world is a product of my choices, there are no excuses. Yeah, and this is a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt that basically captures it almost word for word. In the long run, we shape our lives and we shape ourselves. The process never ends until we die, and the choices we make are ultimately our own responsibility. Okay, a lot of people don't want to hear that. And he's going to go even further. He's going to say, not only are you responsible for yourself, but you are responsible for setting out a model for mankind. He says, through your actions, you are simultaneously, how can I put this? We all act in accordance with a picture of how we think man ought to be. So through our choices, we are affirming certain values, certain actions. And what we are saying through our choices, whether we do it consciously or unconsciously, is you're saying anybody in my similar position ought to do the same. Okay. So through our actions, we are actually redefining what it means to be a human being. Okay. And what we're supposed to be doing, what we're supposed to value, what we're supposed to be directing our energy towards. All right. So he says, your action is kind of like a vote. Whenever you act towards something, you are in some sense affirming that is what a human being in a similar circumstance to yours ought to do. Okay. So he says, in choosing myself, I also choose for all mankind. We are making mankind as we go along. We are going to decide what values, what morals, what principles, what projects are going to be pursued. Okay, we are going to decide, whether we want to live in, a nation of, I don't know, white nationalism, or whether we want to live in a world where we all upload ourselves to, a digital interface and everything is mediated through a screen. We decide, okay, and all of our choices are in some sense a vote in that given direction. So what has he done here? Let me kind of just try to articulate what he's done. He has undermined a sense of morality that comes from a source that is independent from us. Okay, he says that if there is a morality, if there are values, they don't come from God, they don't come from some otherworldly source. If there is such a thing as a society or morality at all, it comes from us. So he's sort of kind of re-engineered morality as also being our own choices. Okay, so he hasn't done away with morality. He says we are all acting in a way that we want to sort of be a model for everybody else. It sounds a little bit like you guys are familiar with Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant says something like that. Okay, he says, we should all act in a way that we, through our actions, are affirming the kind of world that we want, that we would want to live in. Okay, whereas like Gandhi says, be the change you want to see in the world. I don't like quoting that because I've heard it so many times it's gotten a little bit cheesy now, but that's kind of like what Sartre is saying. Okay, I'm not sure if he's saying because he's sincere about it or because he's scared of the implications of his atheism. Okay, the implications of his atheism are everything goes. It's a free-for-all. Okay, there's nothing to restrict you from stealing, from killing other people, and so on. But the fact of the matter is that even if there were no laws, many people wouldn't do it because we say, well, the world that we would want to live in, the world that we are responsible for, is a world where I wouldn't go out and do these things, regardless of whether there were laws or not. That's not true for everybody. Okay, let's proceed. It says, in creating ourselves, we are creating an image of man, and in doing so, we are proclaiming how man ought to be. So in choosing, we are affirming. Therefore, when you choose for all mankind. Okay, so whether you do that consciously or unconsciously, let's say you choosing to go to college, unconsciously sends a message to the people around you that this is something that you regard as valuable, and therefore it simultaneously increases the value of that thing. Okay, you buy into it. Okay, you are affirming it. Okay, you get the point. This I already said. Okay, we cannot choose our circumstances, our external circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them. Okay, that's Epictetus. Basically summarizes it. Okay, let me try to end this in the next 5 or 10 minutes or so. I think we should be able to. So now, when does this go wrong? He says we go wrong when we do not take responsibility for our lives and for the world that we find ourselves in. What he calls bad faith. Bad, or in French he calls it mauvaise foi, is we make excuses. We forfeit our responsibility, or we convince ourselves that we are not involved in the situation. Okay, this is another good quote from the documentary. This is actually a very good quote. Another one of his friends says this. He says, Jean-Paul Sartre would not say, get involved, or you must get involved. Jean-Paul Sartre would say, you are involved, and you might not even know it. Okay, that's beautiful. It's not, oh, get involved, or you must get involved. You are involved. Okay, We are all in it. Okay, we're all in the same boat. You already are involved, whether you know it or not. Okay, so when does this go wrong? It goes wrong when we forfeit our freedom and our responsibility to something else. Okay, we make excuses, or we rely on the group. Okay, the herd is going to fix the problem. It's not me. I don't have to take responsibility for my actions. It's the herd, or the people in power, or the politicians, or the corporations. They're the ones that are gonna, do this stuff. So again, there's a moral imperative there. There's no kind of a moral imperative that you have to, if you really care. This is the point. If you really cared about something, then you would have done it. Okay. Your life is ultimately a reflection of your values. If you haven't done it, then it's probably because you didn't care about it that much. Okay. Oh, I wish I went to school. Well, if you cared, you would have gone. I wish I wrote a book. If you really cared about writing the book, you would have written it. Okay. So when does this go wrong? Catherine Genovese. Catherine Genovese is a young woman who got killed in New York City in 1964. And why do we speak about Catherine Genovese specifically? Is because as the story goes, and now there's a little bit of, people have different interpretations of the story, but how this is normally used is what is called the Genovese syndrome, or what is also sometimes called the bystander effect or diffusion of responsibility. That she got killed in front of her apartment building, and apparently there were like 40 witnesses to the crime, and nobody called the cops. Nobody called the cops because of a diffusion of responsibility. Everybody says, I'm not responsible for the situation because surely somebody else already is. I don't have to call the cops because somebody else already has. Okay. And therefore, what we all would have done individually, nobody does collectively. It's a very strange kind of tragedy. It's like the tragedy of the commons. Okay. If you're the only one there and somebody's having a heart attack, you call the ambulance right away. Okay. But if there's 100 people in the room and somebody's having a heart attack, nobody calls the ambulance. Or there's a delayed response to the situation, and there's a delay in calling the ambulance. It's a very strange thing. Okay. Diffusion of responsibility. Let me see here. What else I want to say? Okay. Let me just say this. This is not part of the text, but something that I also want you to retain. Is he says another way that we lose responsibility for ourselves is what he calls we are obsessed with what other people think of us. Okay, what he calls being for others, which is a kind of a disingenuous way of living your life. As you know, I guess it would be the opposite. Let's say being for oneself, being authentic and being truthful to oneself, being your own person. In this case, you are being for others. You are, in some sense, a being for others. Your identity, your self-worth is you have transferred that over to, you've given that to other people. Okay, you are now simply just a subject and a product of the impressions of other people. Okay, so he says we are obsessed with this. We feel ourselves. He says we feel ourselves through the eyes of other people. Okay, we can somehow see how we are perceived, and we are kind of obsessed by this. Okay, and this is obviously true with modern age social media and Facebook and so on. That we don't live in isolation. Okay, we don't live in our own little worlds. We live in other people, around other people, and we allow ourselves to be dictated and determined by other people. And it's a kind of a vicious circle, because the same people that you allow to determine who you are also in turn themselves determined by the people around them. So we're always sort of, never really knowing who we are. We're always sort of recalibrating ourselves based on what other people think, but those other people are also constantly being recalibrated with the people around them. So it's a bloody mess. Okay. Let me skip over. Basically, he says, we feel the eyes of other people. Okay. We feel their judgments. We feel their analysis of us. So this is from one of the plays, No Exit. Okay. Where basically these three people are in kind of purgatory. They just died. And they all died in a kind of a moment where their self-identity and their self-worth was in jeopardy. It was in question. And now that they're in purgatory, they're in this little room here. They all are trying to get a sense of who they are and their own self-worth and their own dignity from relying on the other two people in the room. Okay. So you get this scene where, the ladies are looking into each other's eyes. And one of them is a kind of this vain lady, she's kind of obsessed with her appearance. And so she says, I need a mirror. And the other lady says, you can use the reflection of yourself in my eye. So that's kind of, it's figurative. It's literal, you can use the reflection of yourself in my eye, but it's also figurative in the sense that your image of yourself is partly going to be dictated by the image that I'm going to give you back to you. Okay. And there's this kind of soldier here that died in a moment of cowardice. So he's like struggling with whether or not he's a coward. And he needs this kind of reassurance that you can't find it in yourself. You always have to sort of rely on other people. Okay. So he gives the example of, let's say, a waiter who is kind of phony. Okay. You end up being, you're playing too much of a role that you're not an authentic person anymore. You're kind of phony. There's something fake about you. Okay. You've seen people like this, people that they smile too much. It's like, it's just a little bit weird. They're just smiling just a little bit too much. It doesn't make sense, So it says a waiter who is a little bit too willing to be too friendly, too helpful, okay, too willing to play the part of a waiter rather than being less friendly, helpful, and waiter-like, but more authentically himself. So we get caught up in the sort of the roles that we are sort of made to play. He says it denies his authentic ego because he's caught up in the idea of what a waiter ought to be. So this is the quote here. Okay, let me just read it. This is the quote. He puts a little bit more words than he has to, but it's still well stated. He says, when the picture of a man has of himself is provided by those who see him, in that distorted image of himself, which they give back to him, he has rejected reality. Okay. The picture that you have of yourself is the picture that other people give of you is a distortion of reality. Okay. It's just another sort of, it's just another make-believe construct. But instead of it being your own construct, it's the construct that is housed in the minds of other people. He has, moreover, rejected the possibility of projecting himself into his future and existing in the fullest sense. So we're also limited by other people, okay? Limited by what he calls this being for others. We fail to take responsibility for ourselves in this other way, okay? So I think here we're concluding here. So that's it, okay? He says, again, this idea of a portrait. Your life is your portrait. Your life is the sum of your choices. That's it, okay? Ultimately, you're going to be judged with what you do and the choices that you make. And that's ultimately the sum of your life. He says, in life, man commits himself, draws his own portrait, and there's nothing but that portrait, okay? Man is nothing else but what he purposes. He exists only insofar as he realizes himself. There is therefore nothing else. He is therefore nothing else but the sum of his actions, nothing else but what his life is. And there is, for some, nothing other than that. There is no higher game. There is no higher purpose. There is no other meaning than that which you make for yourself and of yourself. Okay, so that's a little bit scary and also a little bit stimulating. Any questions or comments with regards to that? No?